My elder golden brother controlled the family, but when my friend spoke to my mom, she was outraged, and my brother was offended. I'm not even sure where to start with this, but I feel like I'm suffocating in my own family. I'm 34 years old, the middle child of 3. My older brother, Jason, is 39 and the textbook definition of a golden child. My younger brother, Luke, is 22 and well, he's a whole different story. This is going to be long, but I really need to vent. Growing up, my mom made it clear that Jason could do no wrong. He was the star quarterback in high school, got straight A's, and eventually landed some high-paying tech job in Silicon Valley. Mom used to parade him around like a trophy, telling anyone who would listen about how perfect her firstborn was. The thing is, Jason isn't a bad guy. He's polite, successful, and charming when he wants to be. But he's also selfish, manipulative, and completely blind to how mom's favoritism affected the rest of us. Then there's me. I've always been average. I got decent grades, went to a state college, and now I work as a graphic designer. Nothing flashy, but I'm proud of the life I've built. Mom? Not so much. Every conversation with her feels like a subtle jab. Oh, that's great, sweetie, but did you hear about Jason's new promotion? Or you're still doing that art thing? When are you going to find a real career? It's like I'm not even a real person in her eyes, just a placeholder between her golden boy and her youngest. Luke, on the other hand, is a mess. He dropped out of college after a year and has been bouncing between part-time jobs ever since. Mom constantly compares him to Jason, which I know eats away at him. But Luke has his own issues too. He's been arrested twice, once for a DUI and once for shoplifting. Mom bailed him out both times, but not without reminding everyone how much he's disappointed her. It's a toxic cycle. She tears him down, he acts out, she swoops in to save him, and the whole thing starts over again. The real tipping point came a few months ago. It was Mom's birthday, and she decided to throw herself a huge party at her house. Jason flew in from California with his wife, Amanda, who, by the way, is just as insufferable as Mom. Luke showed up late, looking like he hadn't showered in days, and I brought my boyfriend, Adam, who Mom barely acknowledges because he's not ambitious enough. The night started off tense and only got worse. Mom was in full bragging mode, showing off the expensive bracelet Jason had bought her and making snide comments about Luke's lack of direction and my quirky little hobby. She meant my job. At one point, she actually said, "I don't know where I went wrong with 2 of you. At least Jason makes me proud." I swear. I saw Luke's fist clench, and I had to grab Adam's arm to keep myself from yelling. Then, after dinner, Jason decided to give a toast. He stood up, all smiles, and started talking about how much Mom meant to him. It was fine at first, but then he started listing all the things she'd done for him over the years, driving him to football practice, helping him with college applications, paying for his wedding. He didn't mention Luke or me once. Not a single word. It was like we didn't exist. When he finished, there was this awkward silence. Then Luke stood up, visibly drunk, and said, "Well, I guess we know who Mom loves the most." Everyone froze. Mom tried to laugh it off, but Luke wasn't done. He started ranting about how unfair she's always been, how Jason gets everything handed to him while the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves. Jason tried to interrupt, but Luke just got louder. "You think you're better than us? You're not. You're just Mom's little puppet." I wish I could say I stood up for Luke, but I didn't. I just sat there, staring at my plate, while Adam rubbed my back. Eventually, Mom yelled at Luke to leave, and he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Jason made some snide comment about how Luke was just jealous, and Mom started crying about how she'd done her best. It was a disaster. Since that night, things have only gotten worse. Luke stopped answering Mom's calls, and Jason hasn't exactly been subtle about taking her side. He even sent me a text saying, "You need to talk to Luke before he ruins Mom's health with all this stress." Like, what am I supposed to do? Luke barely talks to me either, and when he does, he's just angry. At Jason, at Mom, at the world. A few weeks ago, I went to visit Mom, hoping to smooth things over. Big mistake. The second I walked in, she started complaining about Luke and how ungrateful he is. I tried to defend him, saying he's struggling and needs support, but she just waved me off. "He's always been a troublemaker," she said. "Not like Jason. Jason appreciates everything I've done for him." I told her that's part of the problem. She puts Jason on a pedestal and treats the rest of us like we're not good enough. She got so mad she actually told me to leave. I haven't been back since. Last week, I got a call from Luke out of the blue. He sounded different. Calmer. Maybe? He said he wanted to talk. So we met up at a coffee shop. That's when he dropped the bombshell. Mom had been hiding something from us. Apparently, when Dad died, I was 15 at the time, he left behind a sizable life insurance policy. Mom used most of it to pay for Jason's college tuition and his first house. Luke and I? We got nothing. Not a dime. I was furious. I confronted Mom about it the next day, and she didn't even deny it. She just said, Jason needed it more. He was going places. Like Luke and I didn't have dreams too. Like we didn't deserve a chance. Dinner at my mom's house was always an ordeal, but this one felt worse. Jason had flown in for the weekend, and Mom was absolutely glowing. She'd spent the entire day preparing, setting out her best china, obsessing over every detail, and barking orders at me like I was hired help. You'll sit across from Jason, she instructed, barely looking up from the table she was arranging. He's had such a busy month. He deserves a good seat. I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. Years of this had numbed me to most of her antics. Jason could have been seated on a throne, for all I cared. As usual, Luke hadn't been invited, not after the blow-up at Mom's birthday. I texted him before I left to make sure he was okay, but he didn't respond. Jason arrived with Amanda, his wife, looking as polished as ever. He wore a tailored suit that screamed wealth, while Amanda had on a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mom immediately fawned over them, practically dragging them into the dining room. Oh, you look stunning, Amanda. And Jason, my goodness, you've lost weight. That contract must be keeping you on your toes. I tuned her out after that, focusing on helping Adam, my boyfriend, with the drinks. He had insisted on coming, even though I'd warned him what he was walking into. You don't have to deal with them alone, he'd said. I appreciated it, but his presence didn't change the fact that I felt like a supporting character in my own family. Dinner started off predictably enough. Mom dominated the conversation, peppering Jason with questions about his job and latest achievements. A $300,000 contract, she marveled, her voice practically dripping with pride. I knew you'd make it big. Remember when you won that essay contest in 5th grade? I always said you were destined for greatness. I could feel Adam's hand tighten on my knee under the table, his silent way of telling me to keep calm. But something inside me snapped. I was so sick of being invisible, of sitting there, quietly watching Mom build Jason into a god while the rest of us were dismissed like background noise. For the rest of the evening, I stayed quiet, letting my anger simmer under the surface. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living like this. That night, back at my apartment, I called Sarah. Sarah is my best friend and, honestly, one of the most incredible people I've ever met. She's a successful architect, absolutely stunning, and has a presence that lights up any room she enters. We've been close for years, and though she's always been a little chaotic, she's the kind of person you can count on to shake things up. I need a favor, I told her. She laughed. This sounds dangerous already. What's up? I need you to come to my mom's house for dinner next week. She paused. Why do I feel like there's a catch? There's no catch. I need someone to have my back. Someone who can hold their own against my mom and Jason. Sarah didn't hesitate. Say no more. I'll be there. The next week couldn't come fast enough. I told Mom I was bringing a friend, but I didn't go into details. She barely acknowledged it, too busy planning another special dinner for Jason. When Sarah and I arrived, Mom's face was priceless. She looked her up and down, clearly taken aback by her confidence and beauty. Sarah walked in like she owned the place, wearing a sleek black jumpsuit and carrying a bottle of wine. Mrs. Harper, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for having me. I've heard so much about you. Mom stammered out a polite reply, clearly unsure how to handle someone like Sarah. Jason and Amanda, on the other hand, looked intrigued. Dinner was a completely different experience this time. Sarah took over the conversation effortlessly, asking Jason pointed questions about his work that left him scrambling for answers. So, what's your take on the latest housing market crash? Must be tricky for someone in your field, she said with a smile that was equal parts charming and disarming. I could see Jason squirm, clearly out of his depth. Mom tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but Sarah wasn't having it. She turned to me, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Anna's work has been incredible lately. Have you seen her latest portfolio? She's got some of the biggest names in the industry chasing her for projects. Mom blinked, clearly stunned. Oh, I wasn't aware. That's because Anna doesn't brag about herself, Sarah said pointedly. She lets her work speak for itself. I felt my face flush, but it wasn't from embarrassment. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The evening continued in a similar vein. with Sarah subtly dismantling Mom's usual narrative. By the end of the night, Jason and Amanda looked visibly uncomfortable, while Mom was unusually quiet. As we were leaving, Sarah turned to me with a wink. I think we made an impression. That night, I felt something shift inside me. For so long, I'd let Mom dictate how I saw myself. Like I was always second best, always less than Jason. But seeing her caught off guard, watching Jason struggle to keep up with someone like Sarah, I realized I didn't have to play along anymore. The fallout came faster than I expected. The next day, Mom called me, her tone icy. Your friend was interesting, she said. But don't you think she was a little much? I didn't hold back. No, Mom. I think she was exactly what this family needed. She didn't respond, but I could hear the tension in her silence. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about standing up to her. Sarah and I laughed about it later, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I wasn't going to let Mom or Jason keep me in the shadows anymore. When Sarah walked into the house for the second dinner, she somehow managed to make an even stronger impression than the first time. She came carrying a small, neatly wrapped box and immediately handed it to my mom. Just a little something, she said with a warm smile. Inside was a delicate crystal figurine of a rose, elegant but understated. Mom's face lit up. I hadn't seen her look this pleased in years. Sarah, you shouldn't have, Mom exclaimed, holding the figurine up to the light. It reminded me of your garden, Sarah replied smoothly, gesturing toward the meticulously kept rose bushes in the backyard. Anna told me you take a lot of pride in it. Mom beamed, and I could see her warming to Sarah even more. Jason, standing nearby, gave me a sidelong glance that I couldn't quite interpret. He was smiling, but there was something tight and strained about it, like he was already feeling sidelined. Dinner started the way it always did, with Mom fussing over the food and Jason trying to dominate the conversation. You know, we're close to finalizing the deal, he said, his voice loud enough to cut across the clatter of plates. Once the paperwork's done, the team will fly me out to the headquarters for the formal announcement. Oh, that sounds wonderful, Jason, Mom gushed, reaching over to pat his hand. I always knew you'd end up working at the top. Sarah didn't miss a beat. What kind of contract is it? She asked, her tone curious but not overly impressed. Corporate restructuring? Expansion? Jason blinked, clearly caught off guard by the specificity of her question. It's more of a strategic partnership, he said after a pause. Very high level. Fascinating, Sarah said, though her expression suggested she didn't find it fascinating at all. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The real shift happened after dinner, when Mom mentioned the old upright piano sitting in the corner of the living room. It had been untouched for years, but Sarah's eyes lit up. Do you mind if I play? She asked. Of course, dear, Mom said, clearly delighted. Jason looked less enthusiastic, his jaw tightening as Sarah crossed the room and sat down at the piano. She played beautifully, classical pieces that flowed seamlessly into jazzy improvisations. Mom was enchanted, sitting forward in her chair like a child at a recital. Even Amanda, who usually spent family dinners scrolling through her phone, put it down to watch. When Sarah finished, Mom clapped enthusiastically. That was incredible, Sarah. How long have you been playing? Since I was a kid, Sarah said modestly. I used to teach lessons in college to pay for tuition. Jason, apparently unable to stand being outshined any longer, tried to steer the conversation back to himself. Well, I think music is great, but it's not exactly a practical career path, he said with a forced laugh. You're lucky you had something to fall back on. Sarah didn't rise to the bait. Oh, absolutely, she said, her voice steady. That's why I shifted my focus to architecture. I found a way to combine creativity with functionality. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek leather album. Actually, I brought this in case Anna's mom wanted to see some of the projects I've worked on. Mom practically leapt out of her chair to take the album. Inside were glossy photos of stunning buildings, sleek modern homes, innovative office spaces, and even a few community centers Sarah had designed as part of a charity initiative. Mom flipped through the pages, her admiration growing with each turn. These are breathtaking, Sarah, she said. I had no idea you were so accomplished. Thank you, Sarah said, her smile genuine. The community projects are my favorite. I love creating spaces that bring people together. I could feel the tension radiating from Jason. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Sarah like she was some kind of intruder. Amanda leaned over to whisper something to him, but he shook his head, his jaw set. Speaking of community work, Sarah continued, oblivious to, or maybe just ignoring, Jason's sour mood. I've been involved with a charity that builds housing for low-income families. It's incredibly rewarding. Mom's eyes lit up. That's wonderful, dear. Jason, didn't your company do something similar last year? Jason gave a strained smile. Yes, we donated to a nonprofit. But it's more about supporting the community from a financial perspective. We leave the hands-on work to the experts. Sarah nodded politely, but didn't seem particularly impressed. The conversation moved on, but Jason's mood didn't improve. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at Sarah, his eyes narrowing every time she charmed Mom with another story or insight. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention, and he clearly didn't know how to handle it. Later that evening, while Sarah was outside with Mom admiring the garden, Jason cornered me in the kitchen. "So, your friend," he said, his tone carefully casual. "What's her deal?" I shrugged. "She's just Sarah." "Why?" "She's a bit much, don't you think?" he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I mean, showing off her portfolio like that." It felt a little calculated. I stared at him, stunned by the hypocrisy. Jason had spent his entire life flaunting his achievements at every opportunity, but the second someone else dared to do the same, it was a problem. "She's not showing off," I said evenly. "She's sharing." "There's a difference." Jason didn't respond, but the way he clenched his jaw told me everything I needed to know. He felt threatened, and he hated it. As the night wound down, Sarah and I prepared to leave. Mom hugged her tightly, something she rarely even did with me. "You must come again soon, Sarah," she said. "It's been such a pleasure having you." Jason muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it. As Sarah and I walked to the car, I felt a mix of pride and relief. For once, Jason hadn't been the star of the show. For once, someone had seen through the facade he'd spent his whole life building. But the evening wasn't over. As we pulled out of the driveway, Sarah turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "You know Jason hasn't signed that contract yet, right?" I nearly slammed on the brakes. "What?" "He mentioned it when we were outside. Said there were some issues with the terms. I don't think it's as solid as he's making it out to be." I didn't know what to say. Jason had built his entire identity around his success, and if this contract fell through, I couldn't even imagine the fallout. But part of me couldn't help feeling a twinge of satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, the golden boy wasn't as untouchable as he thought. The charity event was Jason's idea, of course. He couldn't stand the fact that, for once, someone else had captured Mom's attention. The moment Sarah left our last dinner, Jason's mood turned sour. He spent the next week subtly jabbing at her during phone calls with Mom, slipping in comments like, "She's impressive, I guess, but a bit showy, don't you think?" It was painfully obvious he was trying to reclaim his position as the golden child. So when Mom told me Jason was planning a massive charity gala, I wasn't surprised. "It's for a great cause," she said excitedly. "He's raising money for underprivileged schools." Isn't that just like Jason? Always thinking of others. I nearly choked on my coffee. Always thinking of others? Jason couldn't think of anyone but himself, but I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I nodded along and feigned interest. "What kind of event is it?" I asked. "Oh, he's gone all out," Mom replied. "There'll be an auction, live music, cocktails. He even rented out the ballroom at the Grand Regency. You should come." It wasn't really an invitation. It was an order, and I knew better than to refuse. Besides, I was curious to see how Jason would handle himself with Sarah in the picture. I asked her to come with me, and she immediately agreed. "Sounds fun," she said, her tone tinged with mischief. "And maybe a little dramatic." The night of the event, the Grand Regency was decked out in glittering lights and an obnoxious amount of floral arrangements. Jason had spared no expense, and it showed. Guests milled about in designer gowns and tailored suits, sipping champagne and nibbling on hors d'oeuvres that looked too pretty to eat. Sarah and I arrived fashionably late, and the moment we walked in, heads turned. She was wearing a stunning emerald green dress that seemed to glow under the chandeliers. I felt a pang of envy, but it was quickly overshadowed by pride. She had that effect on people. She could command a room without even trying. Jason spotted us almost immediately and made a beeline for our corner. "Anna," he said, his tone overly cheerful. "You made it. And Sarah, nice to see you again." "Likewise," Sarah replied, her smile polite but distant. Jason wasted no time launching into a monologue about the event. "We've already raised $20,000, he said proudly, and the auction hasn't even started yet. It's shaping up to be a record-breaking night." "That's wonderful," Sarah said. "I'm sure it'll be a success." Jason's smile faltered slightly, as though he'd expected more enthusiasm. Before he could say anything else, a man with a clipboard approached to pull him away. "Duty calls," Jason said with a grin, excusing himself. The auction started an hour later, and it was clear Jason had spared no effort curating the items. There were luxury vacations, rare wine collections, and even a signed guitar from some famous musician I'd never heard of. The bids climbed higher and higher, and Mom clapped excitedly after each item sold. Then the auctioneer introduced a painting. It was a large, abstract piece, bold, vibrant strokes of color that seemed to leap off the canvas. "This next item is an anonymous donation from a renowned artist," the auctioneer announced. Starting bid, $10,000. There was a murmur of interest as the crowd turned to examine the painting. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "That's mine." My jaw dropped. "Wait, what?" "I donated it anonymously," she said with a shrug. "Thought it would be fun." Fun wasn't the word I would have used, but I didn't have time to argue. The bidding had already started, and it was climbing fast. $15,000, $20,000, $30,000. People were practically fighting over it, each bid more aggressive than the last. By the time the gavel came down, the painting had sold for $50,000, the highest price of the night. Jason looked stunned. He was standing near the stage, clearly expecting one of his carefully curated items to be the star of the auction. When the buyer, an older man in a sharp suit, asked the auctioneer for more details about the painting, Sarah stood up. "I can help with that," she said, her voice carrying across the room. All eyes turned to her as she walked toward the stage. Jason's face turned an alarming shade of red. The auctioneer handed her the microphone, and she smiled warmly at the crowd. "I'm the artist," she said simply. The room erupted into applause. Mom looked like she was about to faint, but not in a bad way. She clapped enthusiastically, beaming at Sarah like she'd just won the Nobel Prize. Jason, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to disappear. Sarah spent the next 10 minutes answering questions about the painting and her work. Guests crowded around her, eager to meet the woman behind the masterpiece. Jason tried to insert himself into the conversations, but no one seemed particularly interested in him anymore. Even Amanda looked annoyed, sipping her champagne in the corner. By the time the crowd began to thin, it was clear that Sarah had stolen the show. Mom couldn't stop talking about her. "She's just incredible, isn't she?" she gushed. "Such talent and so down to earth." I half expected Jason to snap, but he stayed quiet, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. It wasn't until the drive home that I realized the full extent of the shift that had occurred. For the first time, Mom had chosen someone else's accomplishments over Jason's. She didn't criticize Sarah or try to diminish her success. She celebrated it, and Jason hated it. That night, as I replayed the evening in my mind, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe the family dynamic was finally starting to change. Maybe, for once, it wasn't all about Jason. The fallout from the charity event was palpable, even if no one talked about it openly. Jason had always been the star of the family, and for the first time, that spotlight had shifted. Straight onto Sarah. Mom couldn't stop talking about her. Every conversation revolved around Sarah's talent, her work ethic, or her charm. "She's just so inspiring," Mom said one evening as I helped her clean up after dinner. "She's everything I admire in a person." "I can't believe she's your friend, Anna. How did you two meet?" The question wasn't malicious, but it still stung. It was as though Mom couldn't fathom how someone as extraordinary as Sarah could possibly be part of my life. I resisted the urge to snap and instead explained how Sarah and I had met at a gallery event years ago. Mom listened intently, her eyes lighting up with every anecdote I shared about Sarah's accomplishments. Jason's frustration simmered beneath the surface, barely contained. He didn't say much during family dinners, but his silence was deafening. Amanda was no better. She'd taken to scrolling through her phone or whispering snide remarks to Jason whenever Sarah was mentioned. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. A few weeks after the gala, Jason invited us all to his house for brunch. It was a classic Jason move, his way of reclaiming his territory. I could tell he was trying to make a statement from the moment I arrived. The house was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furniture, and a view of the ocean that screamed money. "So," Jason said as we sat down at the massive dining table, "I've got some news." He waited until everyone was looking at him before continuing. "Amanda and I just bought a second home. It's in Aspen, a beautiful place right by the slopes." Mom's eyes widened. "Aspen? My goodness, Jason, that's wonderful." "It's a $1.5 million property," Jason added, casually sipping his mimosa. "Perfect for winter getaways." Amanda chimed in. The architect said it's one of the most desirable properties in the area. It's an investment, really. Mom nodded, clearly impressed, but her enthusiasm didn't quite reach the level Jason had probably hoped for. She muttered something about wanting to visit, then turned to Sarah, who was sitting beside me. You've done work in Aspen, haven't you, dear? Sarah smiled politely. I have. A few residential projects and one ski lodge renovation. It's a beautiful area. Jason's jaw tightened. Well, this house is definitely top tier. I'll send you all photos later. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jason kept throwing little barbs Sarah's way, trying to knock her down a peg. But Sarah, as always, handled it with grace, responding with nothing more than a polite smile or a neutral comment. It was infuriating to watch Jason flounder, but also oddly satisfying. Things came to a head later that evening, after we'd returned to my apartment. Sarah and I were having a glass of wine when she suddenly said, "You know, Jason wasn't always so polite to me." I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She hesitated for a moment before continuing. At one of the charity events I worked on a couple of years ago, Jason was there. He made a comment, something about how people like me waste time on charity work instead of focusing on real careers. I blinked, stunned. He said that to you? Not directly, Sarah clarified. It was more of an offhand comment to someone else. But it was loud enough for me to hear. Anger bubbled up inside me. Jason's arrogance knew no bounds, but this was a new low. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah shrugged. It wasn't worth it. He's not the first person to say something like that. But after everything that's happened recently, I thought you should know. I didn't know what to say. I'd always known Jason could be condescending, but hearing it from Sarah made it feel personal in a way it never had before. The next time I saw Mom, I told her what Sarah had said. I wasn't trying to stir the pot, but I needed her to know. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss it or defend Jason. Instead, she sighed heavily and said, I've made mistakes, Anna, with all of you, especially you. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. What do you mean? She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. I've always favored Jason, haven't I? I thought I was doing what was best for the family, but I see now that I was wrong. I put him on a pedestal and ignored the rest of you. It wasn't fair. Her words hit me like a freight train. For years, I'd longed for her to acknowledge her favoritism, but I never thought she actually would. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice shaky. Because Sarah made me see things differently, she admitted. She's an outsider, but she fits in with this family in a way I never expected. And she's shown me how wrong I've been. About her, about you, about everything. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. Do you think Jason knows? Mom sighed. I think he suspects. He's struggling to hold on to the spotlight, but it's not working anymore. And it's my fault. I created this dynamic, and now we're all suffering because of it. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to forgive her, but another part wasn't ready to let go of all the years of pain and resentment. Still, hearing her admit her mistakes was a step in the right direction. That night, I told Sarah about the conversation. She listened quietly, nodding as I recounted Mom's words. When I finished, she said, Do you think things will change? I don't know, I admitted. But it's a start. Sarah smiled. Then that's something. Jason's next move was so over the top, so predictably him, that I wasn't even surprised when the invitation arrived. A glossy, embossed card, with gold filigree and an RSVP code, announcing Jason and Amanda's 10-year vow renewal at the Ashworth Mansion, a sprawling estate that looked more like a palace than a home. I rolled my eyes as I read the invitation. Who even does vow renewals for their 10-year anniversary? I muttered, tossing the card onto the kitchen counter. Sarah, sitting across from me with her laptop open, glanced up and smirked. Jason does, apparently. Let me guess, it's black tie? Of course. And it says there will be live entertainment, a 5-course dinner, and a curated cocktail experience. I can't believe he's doing this. Believe it, Sarah said, closing her laptop. He's trying to reclaim the spotlight. The vow renewal was just the latest in a series of increasingly desperate attempts by Jason to outshine everyone else. After the charity event, he'd been on edge, clearly rattled by Sarah's success and Mom's newfound appreciation for someone other than him. The Aspen house hadn't done the trick, so now he was pulling out all the stops. The guest list was massive, 600 people, including extended family members I hadn't seen in years, Jason's colleagues, and an assortment of wealthy acquaintances he and Amanda had collected over the years. The whole thing felt more like a corporate gala than a family event. But the kicker? The vow renewal was scheduled for the same night as a concert Sarah was hosting to showcase some of the young artists she mentored through her charity. It wasn't a deliberate scheduling conflict. Jason wouldn't have cared enough to check Sarah's calendar, but it felt symbolic. Two events, two very different worlds. When I mentioned the conflict to Mom, she hesitated. "Oh, I don't know, Anna," she said, fidgeting with her necklace. "Jason's been planning this for months. But Sarah's concert sounds so meaningful." I could see the gears turning in her head. She'd spent decades bending over backward for Jason, but Sarah had changed the dynamic in a way none of us had expected. For once, Mom wasn't automatically jumping to Jason's side. "I'll think about it," she said finally, and I could tell it wasn't an easy decision for her. The night of the events arrived, and the split in the family became glaringly obvious. Mom and Luke both chose Sarah's concert, along with several cousins and even one of Jason's uncles, who'd always been critical of Jason's arrogance. I could only imagine Jason's reaction when he realized not everyone had flocked to his side. The concert was incredible. Sarah had pulled together an amazing lineup of performers, singers, musicians, even a spoken-word poet who brought the audience to tears. The venue was packed, and the energy in the room was electric. Mom, sitting beside me in the front row, clapped enthusiastically after every performance, her face glowing with pride. "This is wonderful," she whispered to me during intermission. "Sarah's done something truly special here." Meanwhile, back at the Ashworth mansion, things weren't going quite as smoothly. According to a cousin who texted me updates throughout the night, Jason was visibly tense from the start. Amanda had spent weeks perfecting every detail of the event, but the turnout wasn't what they'd expected. The absence of several key family members didn't go unnoticed, and Jason's mood soured further with each empty seat he spotted. The breaking point came during the dinner toasts. One of Jason's colleagues stood up to congratulate him and Amanda on their perfect marriage, only to make a poorly timed joke about how the vow renewal was almost as impressive as that charity gala Jason's sister's friend pulled off. Jason's face turned bright red, and he cut the man off mid-toast. "Let's keep the focus on tonight," he said, his voice tight. "This is about celebrating Amanda and me." But the damage was done. The tension in the room was palpable, and several guests whispered among themselves, no doubt wondering what had happened to rattle Jason so badly. By the time the evening ended, Jason was seething. Amanda tried to calm him down, but he was inconsolable. "They don't respect me," he said, pacing their suite after the guests had left. "My own family didn't show up. They'd rather waste their time at some amateur concert than support me." Amanda, clearly frustrated, finally snapped. "Maybe if you stopped trying so hard to compete with everyone, they'd actually want to be around you." Jason stared at her, stunned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're exhausting Jason," Amanda said, throwing up her hands. "Everything has to be a competition with you. It's not enough to be successful. You have to make sure everyone knows you're better than them. And it's pushing people away." Jason didn't respond, but the silence that followed was deafening. The next day, Jason called a family meeting. We gathered at Mom's house, unsure of what to expect. When Jason arrived, he was visibly angry, his expression set in stone. "I just want to say this once," he began, standing at the head of the table like a CEO addressing his board. "I've done everything I can to support this family. I've worked hard, I've achieved success, and I've always tried to bring everyone along with me. But apparently, that's not enough." "Jason, that's not fair," Mom said softly, but he cut her off. "No, Mom, it's not fair. It's not fair that I've given so much, and all I get in return is disrespect. If you want to keep celebrating people who haven't accomplished half of what I have, fine, but I'm done. Don't expect me to keep putting in the effort when none of you care." With that, he stormed out, leaving the rest of us sitting in stunned silence. In the weeks that followed, Jason withdrew from the family completely. He stopped calling Mom, skipped family gatherings, and ignored my attempts to reach out. Amanda was the only one we heard from occasionally, and even she seemed distant. At first, it felt strange, like a piece of the puzzle was missing. But as time went on, I realized how much lighter things felt without Jason's constant need for attention and validation. Family dinners became more relaxed. Conversations weren't dominated by his accomplishments, and Mom, for the first time, seemed genuinely happy. One evening, as we sat on the porch after dinner, she turned to me and said, "I think this is what we needed. A chance to breathe. To be a family without all the competition." I nodded, watching the sunset over the garden. For the first time in years, it felt like things were finally falling into place. After Jason's dramatic departure, there was an unspoken sense of relief that settled over the family. For years, Everything had revolved around him. His successes, his demands, his endless competition for Mom's attention. But now, without his constant presence, there was room for the rest of us to breathe. The first sign of change came a few weeks later. Mom called me out of the blue one afternoon. "I was thinking," she said hesitantly, "about how we've never really had a proper Thanksgiving as a family. Not since your dad passed." I blinked in surprise. Thanksgiving at our house had always been a half-hearted affair, overshadowed by Jason's demands or Mom's insistence on inviting a slew of distant relatives who barely knew us. But this time, she sounded different, genuine, almost eager. "What do you mean by proper?" I asked cautiously. "Just us," she said. "You, Luke, me, and Sarah, of course. We could cook together, maybe start a new tradition." The idea caught me off guard. Mom had never been one for traditions, at least not ones that didn't center on Jason. But the thought of a quiet, intimate holiday was appealing. "I think that sounds nice," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. Thanksgiving turned out to be a surprising success. Sarah showed up early to help with the cooking, her usual bundle of energy and charm. She and Mom bonded over the pie crust, of all things, laughing as they debated the best way to roll out the dough. Luke arrived with his new girlfriend, a sweet but shy woman named Mia, who immediately clicked with Sarah. By the time dinner was ready, the house was filled with the kind of warmth and laughter I hadn't realized I'd been missing. At one point during the meal, Mom raised her glass. "I just want to say how grateful I am for all of you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm trying to do better. And I hope you know how much you mean to me." It wasn't an easy thing for her to admit, and I could tell it took a lot for her to say it. But it was a turning point. For the first time, I felt like we were moving forward as a family, leaving the shadows of the past behind. Over the next few months, we started to settle into a new rhythm. Mom made a conscious effort to connect with each of us individually, something she'd never done before. She visited Luke at his new apartment, offering advice on decorating, and even helping him pick out a bookshelf. She surprised me by asking to see some of my graphic design work, genuinely curious about what I was doing. And she and Sarah became almost inseparable, bonding over everything from gardening to charity projects. Sarah, meanwhile, had become a fixture in our lives. It wasn't just her talent or charisma that endeared her to everyone. It was the way she made us all feel seen. She encouraged Luke to pursue his interest in photography, helping him set up a small studio in his apartment. She introduced Mom to meditation, something I never thought I'd see my perpetually high-strung mother embrace. And she pushed me to take on a challenging freelance project that ended up being one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. The absence of Jason was noticeable, but not in the way I'd expected. At first, there was a strange emptiness, like we were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as time went on, that emptiness was replaced by a sense of calm. Without Jason's constant need for validation, there was room for everyone else to shine. That's not to say everything was perfect. Jason's withdrawal from the family left a mark, especially on Mom. She tried to reach out to him several times, but he either ignored her calls or responded with curt, dismissive texts. "He's angry," she said one evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "I understand why, but it still hurts." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt sorry for Jason. He'd built his entire identity around being the golden child, and now that role was gone. But another part of me was relieved. For the first time, I felt like I could be myself without constantly being compared to him. The real test came in the spring, when Sarah suggested organizing a family picnic. "Something casual," she said. "No pressure, just a chance to spend time together." Mom loved the idea, and Luke was on board immediately. We chose a sunny Saturday in May and headed to a park by the lake, armed with blankets, sandwiches, and enough snacks to feed an army. Sarah brought her guitar, and Luke brought his camera, determined to document every moment. The day was everything I'd hoped it would be. We played frisbee, took a paddle boat out onto the lake, and spent hours lounging in the grass, talking and laughing. At one point, Mom pulled me aside. "This," she said, gesturing to the scene in front of us, "is what I always wanted for us. I just didn't know how to get here." Her words stayed with me. For so long, our family had been defined by competition and resentment. But now, it felt like we were finally finding a new way to be together. One that wasn't about proving who was better or more successful. Jason remained on the sidelines, a shadow in the periphery of our lives. Occasionally, I'd hear about him through mutual acquaintances, another promotion, another extravagant vacation. But he never reached out, and none of us pushed him to. It was clear he wasn't ready to be part of the family in this new, quieter dynamic. In his absence, we built something stronger. New traditions began to take root: movie nights at Mom's house, Sunday brunches at my apartment, and impromptu dinners that often ended with Sarah playing the piano while Luke showed off his latest photos. Mia became a regular presence, too, her gentle humor and warmth a perfect complement to Luke's quiet energy. One evening, as we sat around the dining table after a particularly chaotic dinner, Mom raised her glass again. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice steady. "And to the family we've become." It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it felt significant. For the first time in years, I felt like we were truly a family. Not perfect, not without our flaws, but connected in a way we hadn't been before. As I looked around the table, at Mom's smiling face, Luke and Mia whispering to each other, and Sarah laughing at something I'd said, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought was possible. Jason's absence still lingered, but it no longer defined us. We were moving forward, together, and that was enough.